I was sailing a small sunfish around an island near Florida in shallow water. As I cruised along, suddenly, a large section of water directly in front of my bow exploded with a large splash. Immediately afterward, my boat rammed into something under the surface and came to a complete stop. My first thought was, I've hit a reef. But suddenly, the entire boat was lifted up and spun around 90 degrees, almost dumping me into the water. There was another big splash, and I saw something zoom away, leaving a wake behind it. I was left freaked out and shaking. Then I thought to myself, I must have hit a big dolphin. Maybe it was a manatee. Lots of dolphin around here, so I finished up my sail and went home. When I got to the beach, I pulled up the centerboard and found a real surprise. A 2-inch chunk had been bitten out of the wood. You could clearly see the marks of 3 large teeth. I'm very happy that I didn't fall out of the boat that day. Not a sea monster, but definitely one of the strangest things I've ever seen in my life. It was about 2 a.m. in the middle of the Atlantic and very dark with no moon. As I was walking up to the bow of our sailboat to inspect the sails, I saw a faint glow in the water a long way off. I stared at the glow for a long time before I realized there were actually 2 glowing objects moving quickly underwater on a collision course with our boat. Immediately, I thought it was some submarine or torpedo about to ram our boat. But then the glowing shapes came right alongside the boat, perhaps a foot underwater. They were 2 ghastly blue dolphins, glowing brightly and so vivid and close in the clear water. I immediately realized the dolphins were being illuminated by the bioluminescent plankton. But the sight was surreal. I watched them play in our bow for a while, imagining sailors of the past witnessing these eerie dolphin spirits and how mind-blowing that must have been. Not me, but my father, back in his commercial fishing days, noticed that there was a t-shirt in the middle of his net after one tow. After a little investigation, he found out that it was not a shirt, but a human torso wearing a shirt. He said he was terrified that he would open the net and a head would roll out onto his feet. But it didn't happen. His captain radioed ahead, and they brought the torso back to the docks, where they met the police and a coroner. They were eventually able to identify the body, based on the clothing, as a victim of a plane crash that had occurred fairly recently. My dad said he offered a free lobster to the coroner, who graciously accepted it until he found out that it had been found in the net with the body. After that, he got angry and told him to throw it back. I've been in the US Navy for almost a decade now, and I am currently on my 3rd deployment to the Western Pacific. I work on communications equipment and spend a fair amount of time just scanning different frequencies to see what I come across. A couple years back, we were 30 to 40 nm off the coast of the Philippines. It was just over the horizon, and the ship had lost power. Lights, engines, everything just went silent. I don't want to say this is regular, but it's happened enough throughout my career that it doesn't bother me half as much as it should. So, power is out, emergency lights are on, and the UPS are keeping comms up until the engineers can get the power back up. I am doing my usual, scanning high frequencies for anything coming out of the PI, when my receiver starts picking up the most awful, interesting, horrific sounds I've ever heard in my life. I've heard all types of interference. It wasn't that. I've heard people trying to go over encrypted circuit without crypto. And it wasn't that. It raised the hair on my neck and arms and made me feel very, very small. It felt like I was sitting there for hours while these sounds crawled under my skin, like I was traveling through the warp without a proper equipment. After about 5 minutes, it suddenly stopped and the power came back on. I will never forget the sounds I heard. The sounds were primal, not human, like something very large was expressing itself, but I couldn't comprehend it. It wasn't really afraid of it. I suppose in the same way a single-celled organism wouldn't really be afraid of a human. I can't really explain it, because I've never heard of anything that came close to sounding like it. Maybe somebody was transmitting weird sounds that might screw with anybody who might been listening. And maybe it was made by a much creepier timing of losing and gaining power. I'm not so sure. Maybe it was something deep, far off in the ocean, that we have no idea exists. The possibilities are endless when you think about it. Not necessarily deep sea, but still the ocean, night, and creatures. 1985, nighttime, full moon, off a popular fishing spot called East Point in Darwin. My sister and I are in a decent-sized canoe and have paddled out about 2 kilometers or so. I'm an idiot, trying to half scare her and be brave at the same time. Something big bumps the bottom of the boat, a gradual, slow rasp. Hair's all up, crapping bricks. Over the side, we all can see this massive shadow, like one side to the other of the canoe. Fins come out of the water, either side of the canoe. Panic and paddling ensues. My sister is screaming. I can't. I'm the big bro, but my butt was tightly clenched, and I was white with fear. We made it back to the shore unscathed, and found out that it was actually a manta ray. Another time, a mate and I swam to a sandbar, which took us a good 10 minutes to swim to directly out from the beach. We stayed there until the water began coming over our thighs, and then bailed back towards land. A minute into the swim back, and we spotted a decent-sized fish swimming near us. All I can think of was how flipping big the shark crocodile Godzilla it had detached from. The rest of us swam in total fear on my behalf. I went deep-sea fishing last summer. I don't have an insanely terrifying story, but I have a couple that may entertain. Both happened on the same trip. The first story is that at one, a teaser line got caught up in the prop shaft. No big deal. The captain, my friend's dad, turns off the motors, and then a couple of us dive in with goggles. At this point, we were 40 to 50 miles offshore in the Gulf of Mexico. Water depth, 150 to 200 feet. We have a kitchen knife and are trying to cut this thing, insanely tough fishing line, off a circular metal shaft. Being in the water, noticing how clear and blue it was, gave me a sense of awe, but at the same time, a total sense of fear. I knew that the water was as clear as a swimming pool, yet I still couldn't see the bottom. I couldn't see anything, really, except a gorgeous shade of blue. After a bit, my other buddy wanted to help out with the tangled mess, so I got out, gave him my goggles. While down there, the 2 guys noticed that one of these guys was swimming beneath. For y'all who don't know, these remoras look like this on the other side, so getting sucked into one is inadvisable. Basically, the remora began to swim at my friends, so they all just got out of there, and the line was already well enough taken care of anyway. The second story is less intimidating. We had 4 lines out, and one in the middle popped out of the outrigger. The line started flying, and I mean flying out of the wheel. My friends and I rushed to pick up the rod so we can land this apparently massive hunk of sea meat. But the line snapped before we even got to the rod. To this day, I'm not 100% sure what sort of fish that was, although my suspicions was that it could have been a gargantuan kingfish. I'm surprised that I'm running this out, because I'm not the type of person to ever show interest in this subject, but I believe I saw some sort of aquatic sea creature that is either unknown to man or is part human in a sense. Before I go on, I'll give you some background information on me. I'm a professional photographer. I do lots of work for larger clients, and even have some of my work featured in magazines. For that record, I'm going to keep my identity concealed, because if my name gets out, attached to this, it might ruin me. I can't risk that. I've spent far too many years building up my repertoire, so you can call me Ethan for short. Now, the time and place this event took was in 2016. I was visiting the chain of islands of Hawaii, doing some landscape photography of the coast and surrounding spots for a client that was working on a big project. I was out in the early morning hours on the beach of the southwestern side of Oahu. I was setting up to do some landscape shots of the ocean, getting my tripod just right, when to my left, I felt this weird sensation, like someone was looking at me. So I turned out of reaction, and I was astonished at what I saw. Standing out of the shallow water was a creature I can't begin to accurately describe to you. It was a bluish green, had scales covering the entire body, fins, was rather shorter and kind of stubby looking. It was standing there, about waist deep in the shallow water, just watching me set up my tripod. As soon as I noticed it, I yelled out of shock. It swiftly turned back toward the water and disappeared underneath the surface. It almost did like a belly flop, nose dive kind of thing. It was so fast I can't describe it. I have never seen a creature like this before in my life. It looked so human-like. I don't even have anything that comes to mind for me to give you a comparison, because there's nothing that looks like that. I didn't see its lower half, but it was very much so half man, half fish, or sea-like. It had a human-like face with black eyes. It didn't make any noise that I noticed. This thing was probably only about 20 feet away from me. I hadn't seen it because of the angle that I was facing setting up my equipment. Who knows how long it had been there, watching me. This happened during the early morning hours, just as the sun was rising, so I had a lot of visibility and clarity on what I saw. It was so smooth in its movements that after it disappeared back into the water, I tore down my equipment as fast as I could and changed locations for my shooting that day. The hardest part was creating an excuse as to why I couldn't shoot at that location, because my client wanted very specific pictures of that location that I was at. Luckily, I was able to create almost identical pictures at a different location without my client ever knowing. I was not going to go back to that spot at the beach. I don't know what was watching me, but it gave me the creeps. Had I known there's animals like that live in the water, I probably would have thought twice about going down to that spot on the beach. My work is ever going in my list of clients, and it doesn't stop. I have never had anything weird like that happen to me before, or since. With the 4th of July coming up, I have a very interesting tale for you that occurred about 4 or 5 years ago on the 4th of July. My father and I, and some other family and friends were boating out on a local lake. This is a rather large lake, and we were going around to the other side to find a better fishing spot. The time was about 1 p.m. in the afternoon. After we had found a good spot, we did some fishing. My dad booted up the motor again, and we went back to the original docking spot that we were at. Well, my dad noticed on the way back something. The rudder seemed to be acting weird. It wasn't fully functional like it was, and it was making a very odd smell, and sounded a bit weird. It would then have periods where it sounded functional again, or at least semi-functional. My father never thought much of it, but by the time we got to the end of the day, and we were loading the boat back on the trailer out of the water, he saw the most horrific thing. Well, we all did. The reason the rudder had been making all those funky noises as we were on the boat, because something had gotten caught in the blade, jamming it partially when pulling on the engine and having it go multiple times. The rudder must have chopped up whatever this was, because its body was still partially stuck on the rudder. I don't know what it was, and I've never seen a fish like this. It had gills, but was very amphibian reptilian looking. It had a long body, black eyes, and a large gaping mouth with lots of sharp teeth. It was longer than my father, so probably about 8 feet in length. It wasn't an alligator gar. Trust me, I know what those look like. Those are fish, and they definitely look like fish. This looked much more not fish-like, as I said. Very amphibious and reptilian looking. From what I saw, it kind of reminded me of a cross between a frog thing and an alligator, if that makes sense, but with a more eel-like body. It's really hard to describe. It doesn't help that it was pretty mutilated by the rudder blades of the boat, so what we were seeing was its partial body. It had arms though, whatever it was, and it looked like they were clung onto the rudder. It's like it was clung onto the bottom of the boat, right as he started up the engine, would be my guess. It was so freaky. Freaked my dad out, because he's done so much fishing. He ain't ever seen anything like that. My whole family saw it. Tried to convince him it was a sturgeon, but please, sturgeon don't look anything like this did. It was dark green and had patches of black on it. Very bizarre. I didn't take a picture, but I wish I would have. The head was still intact, partially, but its face was torn off, at least half of it, from the blade. Whatever it was large. I forgot to mention more about its face. It had a very short, protruding mouth. Not quite a snout, but very reptile-like, I thought. Or that's the way it looked. The teeth were sharp, and in great numbers, but they too looked more reptile-like than fish. Fish teeth are sharp, but these resembled shark teeth, kind of. It's hard to explain. You would have to have seen it to know what I meant. It took my dad about an hour or two to try and fully pry this thing off of his rudder, so it was completely disengaged. The more chunks of meat he ripped off his rudder, the nastier it was. Very clumpy looking meat. I've had alligator meat before, and it kind of reminded me of that. It's just one of those things that you look back on as something unexplainable. So, this story happened last summer. We have lawn parties every year at my mom's house on the lake. This particular one got pretty crazy, and I ended up real tipsy. But when I drink, I get hyped up, and everything just seems like a good idea. We all kept jokingly saying, "Yeah, we're all gonna go swimming later." As the night drew on, I was warm from running all over the place, so I said, "Okay, time to swim." Everyone laughed, but I was set on it. I probably had the most to drink that night, so no one else could be convinced. I didn't care though. Something about alcohol just makes you feel fearless, even though I knew there were eels around the lake at night, which would usually terrify me sober. I got to the wharf and slowly slipped into the water, and it was a great night to swim. They threw me a life jacket just to be on the safe side. I just sat on in and grabbed my drink. I floated around laughing while they all snapped pictures of me. After a few minutes of fun, all of it wore off and I was a little creeped out. So I got out and we went on with the rest of the night, having a great time. The next morning, we cooked a big breakfast and talked about how fun the night was and how crazy I was for going out into the water. So goes the routine of looking through all the pictures of the night before and uploading them onto social media. Everyone was spread out between the kitchen, dining room, and living room, but the house seemed oddly quiet for how many people were there, and they all started handling their phones to one another, pointing at something. So right away, I was thinking no way, they had some really embarrassing pictures of me. But nobody was laughing. I was confused. Then they handed me the phone and asked, "Do you see anything weird in this picture?" It didn't seem like anything at first, but then I saw it. It looked like figures of people standing around me while I floated there in the lake. I was kind of freaked out, but I thought it could just be fog. I'll look through the rest. I flipped to the next one and examined it. What I saw was in the picture. I zoomed in and looked for an excuse for it, but I can't explain it, and everybody else saw it too. It looked like a horned creature just emerging from the water right in front of me. I had the chills and am so creeped out just reliving this. I'll never swim in that lake again, especially at night. Back in 2010, I got the chance to go fishing off the coast of South Africa, where I saw the biggest shark of my life. Now, I want to stress to you that I've done cage diving before with great white sharks, and it is terrifying, even though it is a thrill. What I saw in the waters this day was larger than any great white shark that I've ever seen. It also looked vastly different. Great white sharks are very distinctive looking. Most of you, assuming you are sharing this with your readers, will know exactly what a great white shark looks like. They look different than a tiger shark or a goblin shark. The shark I saw had a much more narrow face, and if I'm guessing size here, which I'd be pretty good at, I would say it was anywhere between 30 to 40 feet in length. Its overall body, I believe, was more narrow than a great white shark, because a great white has more girth to it. However, great white sharks, unbeknownst to people who don't have experience with them, aren't these crazed blood-seeker man-eaters like Hollywood portrays them. They're not hostile, really. However, the shark we encountered, this single shark that I've never seen before in my life, acted incredibly hostile. It tried to ram into the boat several times and tried to knock some of us overboard out into the water. At least that's what I sensed. I'm just going to say right now that no, I don't believe this was a megalodon, and no, this wasn't a Jaws scenario where it was out to get the ship. I think we had somehow provoked it and angered it, which I just don't understand how. Tiger sharks are also very aggressive sharks and have a very bad temperament. I'm still just trying to figure out how we provoked this particular shark. I have some things to share about this experience and why it's weird. South Africa happens to be a hotbed of shark gatherings because it is also where, during a certain time of year, there's a mass gathering of sea lions and seals. You might want to fact check me real quick for that, because it might just be one or the other. But either way, it's basically a giant dinner bell for a lot of sharks. So what that means is you'll see a huge congregation of sharks coming to this area certain times of year to feed. And because of that, like us, we were lucky to run into a shark that nobody, at least I, hadn't seen before, larger than any great white I'd ever seen or cage dived with. Fortunately, none of us were in the water at the time of this sighting, and the shark only hung around for maybe 15 minutes at most before going and swimming away. None of us tagged it or touched it. It never tried to jump up out of the water and bite us. Nothing Hollywood happened. I'm not going to sit here and feed you some creepypasta sea monster story like you probably want. I'm going to give you reality and facts because it's what you deserve. Anyway, the second detail that I wanted to share with you is that there is speculation that a megalodon is still in existence. And you guessed it, it's speculated to be living right exactly where we were fishing, the South African coast. I don't know if it's necessarily just because of the food source or if it has to do with the climate. It could be a combination of both. There have been whales and other large sea mammals that have washed up with large chunks taken out of them that are far larger than a great white shark. I don't know if we necessarily saw a megalodon that was potentially an adolescent or a juvenile, which is very possible, but I can 100% truthfully say that none of us have ever seen a shark this size that looks quite like this. You might be disappointed to know that it wasn't a 70-foot behemoth of a shark like megalodons are painted to be, but like I said, it is possible this was just an adolescent of a megalodon. You need to remember that the ocean is a vast unexplored territory, and many things could be living and hiding within it. Hell, in the past 20 years alone, with technology ever increasing, we've discovered hundreds, if not thousands of new species that we never thought possible. Even in the last 50 years alone, we've actually been able to discover more and more fish that dwell at the bottom of the ocean, and see life forms that we never thought would be possible. The possibilities here are endless when it comes to the sea. I think that's why the concept of sea monsters like large sharks, the kraken, giant squid, are just so intriguing, because the possibility of them existing is actually very real. We can't fully explore all the depths of the ocean, and when so many nooks and crannies for large fish and creatures to live in and hide out, I don't think we'll ever fully know the truth. The last thing I wanted to tell you is that after the few of us on the boat saw the shark, we had a chance to talk to some of the local fishermen, and they too have seen the same species of shark. They had a specific name for it that they spoke about in their native tongue. One of the fishermen that I talked to said these things are very aggressive, and at one point even capsized his boat with him in it. Either way, it would be a terrifying situation to be having your ship just being capsized with a 30 to 40 foot carnivorous predator swimming beneath you. A lifelong friend of mine who has spent years and years in the Navy had some of the wildest stories to tell me about his time out at sea. Everything you can imagine, from weird lights in the sky to dealing with Somalian pirates, and even more hair-raising things you can imagine. One story that he shared with me, though, always gets under my skin because he knows I'm a sucker for sea monsters. In fact, when I first watched the Pirates of the Caribbean franchise, my favorite parts were always when they were dealing with the Kraken, because it was just this monstrous, monolithic creature of the abyss. While he has not seen a creature like that in the ocean per se, he does have a story that is eerily not too far off. I'll preface this and say that I am terrible at reciting the story. I'll have to reach out to him and get him to contact you so he can give you the story in full with every detail. So for now, I'll just give you the basics of the story. While on a larger Navy ship, he didn't go into detail what kind of ship they were, but that they had spotted an extremely long animal swimming about 40 meters below the surface. This thing was so large that you could faintly see it through the water. My friend calls it the largest sea serpent that he's ever seen or heard of in his life, and told me this thing far exceeded the length of the boat, and the width was even larger than that of the boat. It had so much force underneath the water that it moved the ship off course and set them off path from this large moving object. He couldn't give me any estimates of how long or wide this creature was, but told me it was a behemoth of a creature. This makes me believe that there is such a thing as a leviathan, if we're talking the size he truly told me. He's not a storyteller by any means, and he was dead serious when he was telling me this. Again, this is in the far South Pacific Ocean, the part of the ocean that also happens to be home to some of the deepest parts, with an average depth of around 14,000 feet, if I'm not mistaken. And also, the Mariana Trench sits in this part of the ocean as well. It shouldn't surprise me that something so large dwells in that area of the ocean. The sighting, I was told, was also well documented by that ship, so it's on file somewhere. It even freaked the captain out because he had never seen something so large in all of his days in the Navy. This is a true story that really happened to me back in 2006 when I was living near a beach in Florida, a rather small town in between some bigger beach towns. I had just driven back home to Oklahoma to visit and happened to talk to one of my best friends, Joe, into moving back to Florida with me. One night, Joe and I had decided we were going to head down to the beach, bring a couple of beers and some herb, and chill out down by the ocean. It was a nice night. As we pulled up, I remember parking my car in the beachside parking lot. We were listening to Sublime and opening our first beers when I told Joe I was going to go walk down to the beach. I kicked off my sandals and walked down to the ocean. The ocean was flat, waves barely rolling up against my ankles. As I'm standing there, gazing the open ocean, I hear Joe say something as he started walking down the car towards me on the beach. Then, what I can only describe as an ethereal light, blue lane of light, illuminates me. The light creates a lane, about 15 feet wide. The light illuminated the sand from the ocean to the top of the beach's sand dune, What struck me as odd was that it wasn't a broadcast light in a V shape from the origin. It was a parallel lane of light. It was illuminating the granules of sand in a way I'd never seen light do before. As it lit me up, I exclaimed to Joe, "What is that?" I began to search for the origin of the light. I didn't see nor hear anything in the sky above, so I focused my attention on the ocean. I could somehow sense that this light was coming from near offshore. I squinted to look for any stern lights, assuming that maybe this was coming from a boat. This was a clear night, and in a clear night off the Florida coast, you can see a boat's lights for miles off the coast into the horizon. I saw nothing. No boats, no shadow outlines along the horizon. Nothing. Still, I could sense that this light illuminating me was coming from a few hundred yards off the beach, still unable to physically see the object. This analysis all happened within a matter of probably 30 seconds as the light illuminated me. The light then slowly dissipated off of me. It then lit up Joe's lane for about 10 seconds, who had now descended the top of the beach and was almost closing in on me. Now he's freaking out. Then the light dissipates off of him and illuminated the lane on the other side of me, where there was nothing. Then, the light behaved in a way I will never forget. It did a rapid shuffle of the 3 lanes in a random fashion. It straight up scanned us. The next thing I know, a huge tidal wave is picking me up off the beach. The wave had to have been 20 feet tall. It picked me up off the ground and threw me face first onto the beach like a rag doll. If you've ever skateboarded, I'm sure you've heard the term scorpioned, where you eat it face first, and your legs wrap up over your head from behind you. Worst case scenario kind of ordeal. That's what happened. Not so gnarly. As I got up, I yelled for Joe. I heard him. He had been washed about 30 yards inland. I walked up to him and said, "Dude, are you okay? What the hell was that?" He was quivering and said, "I don't know, man." Just then, I felt this really creepy, spooky, sixth sense feeling come over me, like we'd just seen a ghost. He felt it too. It was written all over both of our faces. I said, "Let's get out of here right now." So we jumped back into my car and hauled ass back to the house. As we're sitting on the couch in the living room, trying to recount what had just happened on the couch, we must have been talking very loud. My cousin, who'd been in bed sleeping, comes out and says, "Guys, it's 4:30 in the effing morning. What are you guys out here yelling about? I gotta wake up for work in like an hour." He was pissed. Simultaneously, we both began blurting out what we had seen, and sounded like we were absolutely insane retelling of what had just happened. He didn't believe us, of course. He asked if we had taken hard drugs or were drunk. We weren't. We'd only both had 1 beer each. Then, as he goes back to his room to go to sleep, I looked over to my friend Joe and said, "Wait, 4:30? We went out there at like 11 and have only been gone for an hour." We both looked at each other with a frightened, spooked look again. The next day, I woke up and had a burn mark around my right eye socket from where the force of the impact on the beach had literally sandpapered what resembled a road rash on my face. I've told myself many things over the years to try and make sense of it. Government helicopters, submarines, tidal wave warning systems. But deep in my gut, I know that Joe and I will never forget, and coincidentally, also never fully remember the time we were possibly abducted by an unidentified, submerged object. I was 20 years old back then. Just a pup. I recovered fast, but the older I got, closer to my 30s, the worse and worse my back showed that I wasn't alright. That the tidal wave that scorpioned me up onto the beach had really messed me up. I have to use a back roller and a back massager daily to do physical rehab on myself from what feels like 3 to 4 completely blown vertebrae. It's literally a daily reminder that whatever happened out there on the beach that night in Florida really did happen.